And the Senate set to vote today on a resolution to block further military action against Iran without congressional approval, as Karen just mentioned. Meanwhile, the House is expected to vote tomorrow on its own resolution, as Karen described. This one would call on President Trump to stop action until Congress formally declares war. Democratic Congressman Brad Schneider of Illinois is here for more on both of those. Congressman, thank you for coming on. The U.S. is already attacking Iran, and President Trump could veto these bills if they do pass Congress. So why hold these votes now?
I think it's important for our country, for the American people to know that Constitution gives only Congress the authority to declare war, to take our nation to war. And the President, as Commander-in-Chief, has the authority to stop an imminent threat, but nothing that this administration has presented, and we had a classified briefing, I have not seen the case of what was the imminence. There's not a debate about the threats Iran poses, the need to end Iran's nuclear program, to address their ballistic missile threat, to thwart their support of terrorism. They're the world's largest sponsor of terrorism.
Hey guys, welcome back to John Podcast. So let's get started. It's happened. For the third time in American history, and all three belong to the same man. The House has voted to impeach Donald Trump. Not a replay of Ukraine or January 6th. A brand new indictment over the Iran war. The chamber was in chaos. The live streams were breaking, and Trump was on Truth Social screaming about a Democrat coup. The White House called it partisan theater, but the gavel fell. The votes were cast.
But to take the nation to war, to take our soldiers, our sailors, our Marines, and put them in harm's way, the nation has to have that debate. And that's what we're calling for. Congress has to be able to exercise its voice. In the meantime, we also are praying for the success and the safe return for every one of our troops.
Are you at all concerned that these resolutions could constrain the U.S. military from protecting Americans?
They don't. They absolutely give the administration and the military the authority and the power to take defensive actions, to protect against threats. But it is the fact that the president does not have the authority to take the country to war. Only Congress does, and we need to have hearings in our committees. We need to have debate on the floor of the House. The American people's voice needs to be heard, and then we can make what's the proper decision to address the threats we face.
History was made again. At the center of this constitutional maelstrom lies a specific explosive accusation: the abuse of war powers related to military strikes in Venezuela. This is the kind of headline that sounds like the end of the world. It sounds like a terminal diagnosis for a presidency. It sounds like the walls are finally, truly closing in.
Yesterday, I spoke with Senator Ted Cruz, and I asked him about Secretary Rubio saying Israel was going to strike Iran with or without the U.S. I want to play you some of that exchange. Democratic Senator Mark Warner says there was no imminent threat to the U.S. There was a threat to Israel. And if we equate a threat to Israel to an imminent threat to the U.S., we're in uncharted territory. What's your response to that?
I think it is unfortunate that Democrats, in the face of any conflict, immediately side with the enemies of America. President Trump, as commander-in-chief, made the right decision to take out a threat, and to do so at a time when the regime was teetering. It was more vulnerable than it has ever been. The consequences are a dramatic improvement for the people of Iran, but also a dramatic improvement for the safety and national security of Americans here at home.
And if you only read the push alerts on your phone or watch the 30-second highlight clips of shouting matches on the House floor, you might be forgiven for thinking that the Republic was teetering on the edge of a cliff. But here is the thing about this particular brand of political theater. Once you peel back the layers of performative outrage and understand the actual mechanics of what just happened, the entire event transforms from a cataclysmic earthquake into something far more predictable, far more cynical, and in a strange way.
What's your response to that?
Well, look, we all are, as I said, we all are praying for the safety and success of our troops. We all want to make sure that we're defending our nation against threats to our interests around the world and in the homeland. But we need to have the discussion and conversation. The administration has been giving a whole host of different reasons for starting this war at this point, and has not been clear on what are the objectives or the strategy for achieving those objectives. We don't need just to slow down Iran's march to a nuclear weapon. We need to block it permanently and be sure that they never can have a nuclear weapon. We need to secure Iran has supposedly enough fissile material, highly enriched uranium, to produce a number of nuclear bombs. We need to make sure that's secured. what is the strategy to achieve our goals, not just in the immediate term, but the long term, because the outcome, we can't, and the president said this the other day, it will not be a success if 5 years from now there's just a new regime in Iran who's doing the exact same things this regime is doing, oppressing its people, threatening its allies, and threatening the United States. We need to make sure that Iran is completely blocked forever from having a nuclear weapon, and that whatever replaces this regime is one that brings Iran into the family of nations, helps us establish within the Middle East and around the world a more secure, stable government in Iran, and not a threat to our allies or the U.S.
Secretary Hegseth already said this morning the results of this operation so far have been incredible and historic. The goals he described are exactly what you just said. So could Democrats' criticism of this decision backfire if this mission is a success?
Far less impressive than the fever swamps of social media would have you believe. But before we go any further, let's cut through the noise with a moment of real talk. You cannot trust the mainstream media ecosystem to give you the straight story on this. They are either cheering for the collapse or running defense for the indefensible, depending on which channel you flip to. That is precisely why we built this platform. We are here to bring you the actual context.
Look, we want to make sure Iran is no longer a threat to the United States, to its neighbors in the Gulf, to Israel, or anybody else. That is something that we all share. We want to make sure that there's a plan in place, not just for the short term, but the intermediate and the long term. This administration has been giving explanations and justifications all over the board. They're blaming others or not taking responsibility themselves. We need clear answers. Congress needs to have its voice heard, and we're the ones who have the authority to take the nation to war, to decide when the nation goes to the war. Congress needs to hear from the administration the facts in a clear and, in many cases, classified, but also in many cases a very public way, so the American people are prepared to stand by our nation.
Yesterday, I also spoke to one of the many Americans stranded in the Middle East. He was flying home from a wedding in India and ended up stuck in Qatar. How are you and other lawmakers working to help evacuate Americans trying to get out of the region?
The unvarnished mechanics of power and absolutely zero corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the curve and actually understand the game being played beneath the surface of the headlines, you need to be on the inside. Join our free newsletter. We cut through the nonsense and deliver the real news straight to your inbox every single day. Just hit the link in the description to lock in your spot. And if you believe in what we are building here, a community that actually values the truth over the talking points.
Yeah, I heard from constituents as early as Saturday saying they were stranded in the region and what's going on. Again, this is one of those cases where we've heard mixed signals coming from the Secretary of State and the Department of State. We have told everybody, and I'll tell them right now, if you are in the region, if you're seeing this, register with the STEP program online. Make sure that the embassy and the local the American consulate offices in the regions know where you are so they can communicate with you. But the Secretary needs to put together a program to help all those who are stranded, who are caught in this war without notice, to help bring them to safety and bring them home.
You're on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. What do you want to hear from the Secretary of State and other administration officials about their decision-making on Iran?
I want to understand what was the imminent threat that brought us to this point right now. But just as important, in fact, more importantly, I want to know what the strategy is to achieve our goals. What are our goals? How will we make sure that we can achieve a deterrent effect to end Iran's nuclear program, to end their support of terrorism in the region, not just in the Middle East, but they support terrorist activity even in the Western Hemisphere? And how do we set a course that will bring more stability and ultimately peace to our allies in the Gulf?
All right, Democratic Congressman Brad Schneider.
Then join us. Be part of the movement that cares about what happens when the cameras turn off. All right, let's dive back into the belly of the beast. So, House Democrats, wielding the gavel they recaptured in the midterms, forced a floor debate and a subsequent vote on a fresh batch of impeachment articles. The core of their legal and constitutional argument is straightforward, at least on its face. They assert that Trump bypassed the legislative branch entirely to wage undeclared war. They are pointing their fingers at the military operations conducted against the Venezuelan regime, and they are screaming from the rooftops that the President of the United States violated the explicit text of Article 1 of the Constitution by failing to seek, let alone receive, congressional authorization before dropping ordnance on a sovereign nation's infrastructure. Their argument, articulated through hours of floor speeches, is that this is the behavior behavior of an executive who views the separation of powers as an inconvenient suggestion rather than a structural mandate. They paint a portrait of a man operating like a dictator, a president who has so thoroughly abandoned any pretense of respecting the legislative branch that he now believes he possesses the unilateral right to take the nation to the brink of war based on a whim or a bad intelligence briefing. And yes, they secured the votes. The House formally impeached him. That is not a matter of spin or alternative facts. That is a matter of the congressional record. The House voted to adopt articles of impeachment against Donald Trump for the third time in his political career. But here is the crucial distinction that about 90% of the political commentary class either fails to grasp or deliberately obfuscates because it ruins the drama. The act of a House impeachment is not a conviction. It is not a removal. It is not even a guilty verdict in the criminal sense that most Americans understand. An impeachment vote in the House is the constitutional equivalent of a grand jury handing down an indictment. It is the first step. It is the formal accusation. It is the prosecution saying, "We believe we have enough evidence to charge this individual with high crimes and misdemeanors." It does absolutely nothing to change the occupant of the Oval Office. It does not strip him of a single power. It does not bar him from Air Force One. It simply means the House has done its part. And now the baton is passed across the rotunda to the United States Senate. And that, my friends, is where this entire narrative slams into a brick wall of political reality. The Senate is the trial court. The Senate is where the witnesses would take the stand and the evidence would be laid bare. The Senate is where the final binding judgment of conviction or acquittal is rendered. And the Senate is controlled, lock, stock, and barrel by the Republican Party. So let's dispense with the theatrical suspense right up front. We need to be absolutely brutally clear about what is going to happen next, because the outcome is as preordained as a WWE match with a predetermined finish. This impeachment will die in the Senate. It will be dead on arrival. It will be a ghost at the feast. Trump will not be convicted. He will not be removed from office. He will not be barred from running for anything ever again. This entire exercise is, at its core, purely symbolic. But let's not dismiss it as meaningless just because it lacks the teeth to physically remove the man. We need to talk about why this is happening now and what it reveals about the underlying political geology of this moment, because that's where the real story lives. It is genuinely wild, almost prophetic, that Trump himself predicted this exact scenario with stunning clarity. Cast your mind back. He stood before crowds and said, effectively, if those people take the House, they will impeach me. It doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter if the economy is soaring or if the world is at peace. The moment they get the gavel, they're coming for me. He called his own shot. He understood the incentive structure of the modern Democratic Party with such precision that he could foretell his own impeachment months in advance. And then, like clockwork, it happened exactly as he described. That is a level of political self-awareness that is frankly unsettling. He knows the playbook because he forces them to play it. He operates in a way that guarantees this reaction, and then he feigns shock and outrage when the reaction materializes. It's a closed loop of chaos. The chaos surrounding the Venezuela strikes is, to be fair, not manufactured out of thin air. There is genuine, substantive unrest within the Republican conference about how this was handled. Senators like Collins and others have voiced legitimate discomfort about being kept in the dark while bombs were falling on Caracas. There are real, profound, and constitutionally significant questions about whether the president should have sought congressional approval before launching these operations. War powers are the original third rail of American governance. The founders were obsessive about this specific power dynamic. They had just fought a war against a king who could summon armies and navies at his pleasure. They were determined to ensure that the new republic would not simply create an elected monarch with the same unfettered control over life and death. They deliberately, carefully, and explicitly vested the power to declare war in the Congress of the United States. The president is the commander-in-chief. He commands the troops once the war is authorized, but the authorization itself, the decision to move from a state of peace to a state of armed conflict, that belongs to the representatives of the people. So when Donald Trump decides to rain down missiles on a foreign nation without even a courtesy phone call to the Speaker of the House or the Senate Majority Leader, he is not just being rude. He is walking right up to the edge of a constitutional cliff and daring the legislative branch to push him off. This is the legitimate, high-minded core of the impeachment accusation. The president is trampling on the Constitution's allocation of the war power. That is a real issue. That is a serious accusation. But whether that specific action rises to the constitutionally mandated level of high crimes and misdemeanors is an entirely separate inquiry. And more importantly, whether that accusation is potent enough to convince a room full of Republican senators, many of whom owe their careers to Trump's endorsement and his base voters, to vote for conviction is a question with an answer that is already written in stone. It is a hard no. Trump's response to being impeached for a third time has been exactly what you would expect, and that is precisely the point his opponents are trying to make. The unhinged, vitriolic, caps lock-laden tirades on his social media platform are not the reactions of a man who respects the process. He calls it a coup. He calls the judges haters of America. He claims the entire constitutional apparatus is a rigged game designed to destroy the country. He is doing the full routine, the greatest hits of grievance. And in a cruel irony, his very response is Exhibit A in the case against his fitness for office. His opponents argue that a man who cannot accept the legitimacy of a co-equal branch of government checking his power is, by definition, a threat to the republic. Every time he screams witch hunt, he is proving their point that he does not believe any authority exists that is higher than his own. What is most revealing about this specific moment in the endless Trump saga is not the shock of the event, but the utter predictability of it. He called his own shot. He said they would do it if they got the power. They got the power. They did it. And now he acts as if the sky is falling. He acts like this is an unprecedented, unexpected ambush, when in reality, it is the most predictable outcome of the midterm elections. It is the logical, almost mathematical result of Democrats taking control of the House gavel. Trump understood the political calculus perfectly. He knew the incentives. He knew the pressure the progressive base would put on leadership. And when it happened exactly as he described, he pivoted to playing the victim. It is a masterclass in controlling the narrative, even if that narrative is one of perpetual persecution. Let's drill down into the war powers issue itself, because that is the engine that is driving this entire impeachment train. The accusation is that Trump conducted military strikes against Venezuelan targets without securing congressional approval. That is the beating heart of the articles of impeachment. Now let's acknowledge the nuance that gets lost in the screaming matches. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. The Constitution and 2 centuries of precedent grant the executive broad, inherent authority to use military force to protect American lives and interests, especially in situations that are fluid, tactical, and time-sensitive. Nobody seriously argues that the President needs to call a vote in Congress before ordering a SEAL team to rescue a hostage or before shooting down an incoming missile. There is a zone of operational autonomy. The question has always been about where the line is drawn. When does a tactical strike become a sustained military campaign? When does a limited engagement become a war in all but name? If you are launching coordinated multi-day operations against the sovereign infrastructure of a nation with which we are not technically at war, at what point does the spirit of the Constitution demand that the people's representatives have a say? The founders put that power in Article 1 for a reason. They understood that war is the most devastating, expensive, and morally weighty decision a nation can make. They wanted it to be hard. They wanted multiple competing factions, the House, the Senate, the executive, to all have a stake in the decision. They wanted friction. Trump's actions in Venezuela essentially eliminated that friction entirely. He didn't consult. He didn't notify. He simply acted. And that is the specific behavior that triggered this impeachment. The irony is thick. Venezuela is a sovereignty issue. We are talking about sending American pilots and American bombs into the airspace of another country. This is precisely the kind of scenario the War Powers Resolution and the Constitution were designed to address. And Trump's response to the pushback is not to engage in a debate about the limits of executive power. It is to attack the legitimacy of the people doing the pushing. He claims Congress is trying to micromanage a war. Congress would argue they are simply trying to exercise their constitutional prerogative to declare one. Now let's talk about the hard, cold political math that renders this entire exercise a foregone conclusion. The Constitution sets a very high bar for conviction and removal. It requires a supermajority of 2/3 of the Senate. That is 67 votes out of 100. The Republican Party currently holds a majority in the Senate. Even if you assume, for the sake of argument, that every single Democrat and every single independent votes to convict and remove Trump from office, a near certainty, the math is still nowhere close. You would need to find at least 17 Republican senators who are willing to look into the camera, face the wrath of the MAGA base, and vote to permanently banish Donald Trump from the political landscape. That is not going to happen. It is not a matter of courage or cowardice, though both play a role. It is a matter of political survival. Donald Trump is the singular gravitational force in the modern Republican Party. To vote to convict him is to sign your own political death warrant. It guarantees a primary challenge funded by Trump-aligned PACs. It guarantees a torrent of abuse on social media. It guarantees being ostracized from the party machinery. For the vast majority of Republican senators, the risk calculus is simple. Voting to convict ends your career. Voting to acquit keeps you in the game. So, the Senate will hold a trial. It will be a spectacle. Perhaps one or two retiring senators, a Mitt Romney type, or a Liz Cheney acolyte will vote to convict as a matter of conscience, a final, noble gesture toward the history books. But the vast, overwhelming majority will vote to acquit. Trump will walk. He will declare total and complete exoneration, and the news cycle will churn on to the next outrage. But to call this meaningless, simply because it fails to meet the two-thirds threshold in the Senate, is to misunderstand the purpose of the exercise. This is not solely about removal. It is about branding. It is about creating a permanent, indelible record. Even a failed impeachment has political utility. It shatters the illusion of Republican unity. It forces every single Republican senator to go on the record, either defending unilateral war powers or hiding behind procedural objections. It reignites the dormant narrative that Trump harbors dictatorial ambitions and views the Constitution as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a blueprint to be followed. It damages an approval rating that is already scraping the bottom of the barrel. From a purely cynical, strategic, political perspective, this impeachment makes perfect sense for the Democrats, even if they know they are going to lose the final vote. They are not trying to remove Trump via the Senate. They know that door is welded shut. They are trying to damage him. They are trying to frame the upcoming midterm election around the question of whether we want a Congress that will check an imperial presidency or a Congress that will rubber stamp military adventurism. They are trying to highlight the divisions and the weakness within the Republican conference. They want to run ads showing Republican senators shrugging off a presidential war powers abuse. And from that perspective, a failed impeachment is a resounding success. It gives them a cudgel. It gives them a narrative. It gives them a reason to turn out their base. Here is the crucial distinction that makes this third impeachment different from, say, the second one over January 6th. This one touches on a genuinely significant, structural constitutional issue that transcends the tribal politics of the moment. War powers are not a trivial matter of hush money payments or perfect phone calls. The allocation of the power over war and peace is the central, defining feature of the separation of powers. The framers set it up this way specifically to prevent any one person from having the power to drag the nation into a bloody, unwinnable conflict on a whim. They wanted friction. They wanted checks. And what Trump is doing, what presidents of both parties have been doing for decades, to be fair, is eroding that check to the point of irrelevance. He is saying essentially, I have the planes and the bombs, therefore I have the authority. That is a radical, almost monarchical view of executive power. And the response from the legislative branch, the branch that is supposed to be the most powerful under the original constitutional design, is to hold a vote, issue a sternly worded rebuke, and then watch as the Senate fails to act. That is the tragedy of the modern Congress. It has the power, it has the Article 1 authority, but it lacks the political will to wield it against a president of its own party. The real terrifying question that hangs over all of this is not whether Trump gets convicted in the Senate. We know the answer to that. The real question is whether the constitutional system of checks and balances can survive a president who doesn't just push the boundaries, but actively campaigns against the legitimacy of the boundaries themselves. Can a system designed around the principle of separated institutions sharing power function when one branch decides it doesn't need to share? Can the courts and Congress actually stop a president who is determined to expand executive power beyond any previously recognized limit? Or are these checks and balances just quaint, part parchment barriers that crumble the moment they are tested by a sufficiently determined executive. That is the experiment we are living through. The courts have blocked his election orders. They have blocked his tariff schemes. Congress is now impeaching him for war powers, and yet he remains in office, wielding the machinery of the state, and his power continues to expand because he refuses to accept the premise that it can be limited. The impeachment is a symptom. The disease is a presidency that views itself as unbound. So let's strip away the drama and look at the dry, clinical reality of what happens next. First, the Senate trial. This will be a procedural slog. The House managers will walk the articles across the Capitol. They will present their case about the Venezuela strikes. They will argue that the president is a danger to the constitutional order. Trump's legal team, and you can bet it will be a colorful cast of characters, will mount a defense centered on the Commander-in-Chief's inherent authority to protect national security. They will call the entire process a political stunt, and then the vote. The Senate will acquit. The final tally will be something like 53 to 47, or maybe 55 to 45 if a couple of Republicans cross over. But it will not be 67. Trump will not be convicted. Second, the political fallout. This will become fodder for the 2026 midterms. Democrats will run on a platform of, "We tried to stop his wars," and Republicans let him off the hook. Republicans will run on a platform of, "Democrats are so obsessed with destroying Trump that they're weakening America on the world stage." The impeachment becomes another log on the bonfire of partisan rancor. Third, the expansion of power. The most significant long-term consequence is not Trump's fate, but the fate of the presidency itself. By acting unilaterally in Venezuela and then surviving the impeachment with a partisan acquittal, Trump is setting a precedent. He is establishing that a president can launch significant military operations abroad without any meaningful consultation with Congress. And as long as his party holds at least 34 seats in the Senate, there is no consequence. Future presidents, Republican or Democrat, will inherit this expanded power. They will look back at this moment and say, "Well, Trump did it and got away with it. So can I." The damage to the constitutional order is not just in what Trump does. It is in what the system allows him to do without imposing a cost. The big picture takeaway is grimly fascinating. Trump is accelerating a trend that has been building for a century. The executive branch has been swallowing power from the legislative branch for decades. Trump is just doing it with a sledgehammer and a megaphone instead of a scalpel and a whisper. He is conducting operations that anger members of his own party. He is provoking institutional conflict at every turn. And when the institutions use their rusty, seldom used constitutional tools to push back, he doesn't respect the outcome. He delegitimizes the referee. He screams that the game is fixed. But from a certain perspective, the system is working exactly as designed. Congress is asserting its war powers. The courts are blocking executive overreach. The institutions are trying to check him. The problem is that the man in the Oval Office simply does not care. He wants power without limits. He wants the authority to act without the accountability of oversight. And as long as he has the votes in the Senate to protect him from the ultimate constitutional remedy of removal, he is going to keep pushing. That is the pattern. That is the dynamic we are locked in. It is a constant grinding struggle between a president trying to become a king and a system that is just barely creakily holding the line. This impeachment was a shot across the bow. It was a warning, but the ship is still sailing, and the captain is still at the helm, screaming into the storm.